Okay, 9.2b. There's going to be two main things covered in this video. First, we're going to learn factoring by grouping, and then we're going to learn about solving equations. And I'm going to start out with the grouping first. So, learning factoring by grouping, this is the second type of factoring that you have learned, or will be about to learn. Second type of factoring. So it's called grouping, and what it means is that you're going to use GCF twice. Two different times you're going to be using the GCF. And also the main thing about this type of factoring is that you will only use this when there are four terms. So the first type of factoring that you learned was GCF. GCF you can use no matter how many terms there are. There might be two terms, might be three, might be four, there could even be more. This second type of factoring is only going to be used when there are four terms. So you got to remember that terms, how do you know how many terms there are? Terms are separated by a plus or a minus sign. So you're adding, there's going to always be a plus or a minus sign in between terms. Okay, so the first example of grouping is on page 482, example 2. And the directions will just say factor. So in this whole chapter, the directions are either going to say factor or they're going to say solve. We're going to see about solving in just a few minutes, but right now the directions just say factor. And here's the first thing I want you to factor. 4ab plus 8b plus 3a plus 6. So when you look at this, first you're going to say to yourself, can I take out a GCF? Can a GCF be taken out? So I'm looking at the numbers first. 4, 8, 3, and 6. Is there any one thing that that they're all divisible by? If it was just 4, 8, and 6, I'd be able to take out a 2. If it was just 4 and 8, I'd be able to take out a 4. If it was just 3 and 6, I could take out a 6. But with all four of them, there is no GCF. So that tells me I'm going to go on and try another type of factoring. So because there are four terms, so can you count the four terms here? There's one term, two term, three terms, four terms. In this particular case, they're all separated by plus sign. So if there are four terms, we're going to try to do grouping. So to do grouping, you're going to look at this and separate it into two different groups. So I'm separating it with the parentheses. Then you're going to take the first group and see that there is a GCF. So you're going to factor out that GCF. So in the first group, what do they have in common? A 4 and also a B. So I'm going to factor out 4b. So that will give me 4b times a plus 2. So think about it if you're doing it right. If you're doing it right, then when you distribute, you'll get what you have up here. 4b times a is 4ab, 4b times 2 is 8b. So that part is right. Now in the second part, I'm going to factor out a 3. So the common term, the GCF for the second set of parentheses, is a 3. And since there's a plus sign here, I'm going to put plus 3. Don't forget that plus sign. And then when I factor it out, I get a plus 2. Now, if you have done this type of factoring correctly, then you'll have the same thing in the parentheses. So must be same in parentheses. These have to be the same or you've made a mistake, or grouping won't work. Now I'm not done with this yet. There's one more step. I'm going to take what's on the outside of the parentheses and put it together. 4b plus 3 in its own parentheses. I'm going to take what's in the parentheses. It's there twice, but I'm going to just put it one time in this parentheses. And this is going to be my answer. Now, I'm not sure if I've done it right. I actually am sure that I've done it right, but if you are not sure, what you will do is you're going to FOIL this to check it. So you're going to distribute twice to check. So I'm going to go like this. Do it in red. 4b times a is 4ab. 4b times 2 is 8b. 3 times a is 3a. 3 times 2 is 6. So what I have here has got to match up with what you had in the beginning before you put those parentheses in. So this one is done correctly. So we're going to try another one. Again, the directions are just going to say factor. I look at what I have here, and I look for a GCF. So between 5, negative 15, 4, and 12, there is no GCF. And with the variables, which I should have said on the previous one, with the variables, again, I don't have a variable in the last one, so I can't factor out a variable. So again, I see that there are 4 terms, and so I'm going to go to grouping. And I just make them into groups. I'm going to factor a GCF out of the first group. It would be 5y. And that would be times y minus 3. Out of the second group, it would be a 4. Again, times y minus 3. Now, I see I have the same thing in both of these parentheses, which is a good sign that I'm doing it right. I finish it up by taking what's on the outside of the parentheses, 5y plus 4, then take the ones that were the same, what was on the inside, y minus 3, and that will be my answer. Once again, I'm going to check it for you. So I'm going to rewrite it, and I'm going to FOIL. That gives me 5y squared minus 15y plus 4y minus 12. And so my answer came out the same as what I had in the beginning, so I have done this one correctly. Okay, I've got another one here for you. Again, it says to factor. Again, I'm going to start out by looking for a GCF. So I'm trying to make a point that this has to be a habit that you're going to always look for a GCF of the whole thing first. So between 10, 20, 4, and 8, the GCF is going to be 4. So it does have a GCF. Between C, C squared, D, and CD, there is no GCF because there's not a C in all 4 of them, and there's not a D in all 4 of them. So I'm just going to factor out the 4. Oh, I'm sorry. That was wrong. Not a 4. Fix this. Instead of factoring out a 4, because 4 doesn't go evenly into 10, we have to factor out a 2. Hope you all caught that mistake. So factoring out a 2, that's going to give you 5c minus 10c squared plus 2d minus 4cd. Okay, that's my first step. I factored out the GCF. But now I'm going to look in the parentheses and see that there are 4 terms there. And so whenever there are 4 terms, I'm going to try to factor again, or always you'll try to factor a second time. And by factoring again this time, I'm going to factor by grouping. So this 2, I don't want to lose it. It's going to be part of my answer. So I'm going to put it down here. Now I'm going to factor by grouping what's inside here. 5c minus 10c squared, and then plus 2d minus 4cd. So I've just put the parentheses around here, but I rewrote it. And now I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor of this first set of parentheses, which is 5c, times 1 minus 2c. The second set of parentheses, I'm going to factor out 2 plus 2d times 1 minus 2c. So it looks good because I have the same thing inside here. So I'm going to rewrite the 5c plus 2d on the outside. These two are on the outside. And the thing that repeats goes on the inside. Now, as part of my answer, I've got to have this 2 that I factored out before. So I'm going to write that first, and then all 3 of these is the answer. So I'm going to write the steps of an equation first. And then I'll go through the equation and point out the steps to you. So step 1, every time we have an equation, step 1 is going to be, you're going to set the equation, or set the right-hand side of the equation. Oh, and by the way, if we're having equations, it's always going to say to solve, and there will always be an equal sign. The directions will always be solve, and there will always be an equal sign. So you're going to set the right-hand side of the equation equal to 0. So if there's not already a 0 on the right-hand side, we're going to make that happen. Step 2 is we're going to factor. So this is the left-hand side. We're going to figure out how to factor. Right now we know 2 ways to factor, and we'll try them. Step 3, you're going to set each part equal to 0. So in this step 3, you're breaking the equation, you're breaking it into at least 2 separate equations. Breaking into at least 2 separate equations. And you will have at least 2 answers. Step 4, we're going to solve each equation. So we're solving each part that we just separated. And step 5, since we end up with more than one answer most of the time, we're going to put the answers in braces. So our answers, if there's more than one, we'll put a comma in between. We'll put the 2 answers in braces. Now, this is in your notes now, and I want you to, put a box around it, highlight it. We're going to keep coming back to this through the rest of this chapter. This set of rules we're going to use every time we see the directions solve and every time we see an equal sign. So I'm going to start out with actually a harder problem and then go back to easier problems. So my first example, where it says solve, is just going to say 5m equals 3m squared. So I hope you can still see those steps that we just wrote out, because we're going to use them right now. So step 1 was to set the equation equal to 0. So that the right-hand side I wrote you wanted to set equal to 0. I'm going to first, in this particular one, I want this squared term. And by the way, this set of rules that we're doing right now, the whole reason why we have these set of rules is because we're going to have an exponent that's 2 or greater. And this is the way you have to solve an equation every time you have an exponent of 2 or greater. Well, I actually want that term to be on the left. So I'm going to start by subtracting the 5m and get 0. This is really important that you get a 0. 0 equals 3m squared minus 5m. Now, since I said I want the 0 to be on the right, and I do want this first term to be positive, this is why I subtract it from the left here. So I'm going to switch them around, which is absolutely fine to do. 3m squared minus 5m equals 0. Now I have that 0 on the right where I want it, and I don't have my first term being negative. So step 1 is now done. I've set it equal to 0. Step 2 was to factor. So as I look at this expression on the left, 3m squared minus 5m, I got to factor it. The first type of factoring I always will try is GCF. And this one has a GCF, it's just the letter m. So I have m times 3m minus 5 equals 0. You have to keep writing this equals 0 as we go through the steps. Step 3 is to set each part equal to 0. So that means right here I'm making a line. This is where I'm separating the different parts. Where the parentheses start is where you're separating it. So the part on the left is m, and I'm setting it equal to 0. And then I'm going to bring down the line. So I just separate it and put this part equal to 0. Now I have to put the other part, 3m minus 5, equal to 0. Step 4 is to solve each part. Okay, so on the left, it's already solved. That part is done. On the right, I've got to get m alone. In this case, since the variable is m, I got to get m alone. So I'm going to do that by first adding 5 to both sides and get 3m equals 5. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 3 and get m equals 5/3. Now my second part of my equation is done. I've solved both. So step 5 is to put each answer into braces. My two answers are 0, 5/3. So this is just a solution set. When you have more than one answer, you tend to, this book anyway, tends to always put the answer into solution set. And you could have a comma in between, and it wouldn't be wrong if you did the order the opposite way. It's just listing the different answers. And we will normally list them from the smallest to the biggest, but if you had them in the wrong order, it would not be wrong. Okay, the second example that says solve is going to look like this. H, then parentheses, h plus 5 equals 0. So step 1 was to set it equal to 0. That one's already been done in this problem. That's why this one is now going to be easier. The first step is done. The second step is to factor. So if you see parentheses, then the factoring is already done. They've already set it equal to 0, they've already factored it. So the second step is done. The third step, set each part equal to 0. So that means I got to do what I did last time, make a dividing line where the parentheses is, I set h equal to 0, and then h plus 5 equal to 0. Step 4 is to solve each part. This one is already done. I have to get h alone on the right, so I subtract 5. H equals -5. They're both solved now. Now step 5, I put the answer into braces. I'm going to put the -5 first this time. -5 and then 0. And that's the answer, -5, comma 0. If you had had 0 and then -5, I'm not going to mark it wrong. It's just you've got two answers, and they could be in either order. Okay, that one's done. So the next example where it says solve looks like this. N minus 4 times n plus 2 equals 0. So notice that every one of these that said solve also has an equal sign. So step 1 is to get it equal to 0. Step 1 has been done. Step 2 is to factor. If you see the parentheses, then the factoring is done. Step 2 is done. Step 3, set each part equal to 0. So I'm going to make my dividing line here in between the parentheses. I have n minus 4 equals 0, and I have n plus 2 equals 0. So now I need to solve each part, get n alone in each part. I'm adding 4, and I get n equals 4. I'm subtracting 2. I get n equals -2. I take my answers, -2 and 4, and put them into braces, and that one's all done. Okay, now we're going to go back and do another factoring problem. I will do a couple, and then we'll mix up some problems. So at this point is where I tell you to look at the problem, turn it off, and try to do it. And I know that a lot of you are not doing that. I know a lot of you are just writing down what is written on the screen without thinking about it. But believe me, you're not doing yourself any favors by doing that. You need to start learning it as you're watching the video. And don't waste your time. Do it the right way and actually try these problems. So the first one, it says factor. You're going to have 10x squared plus 5x plus 4x plus 2. So go ahead and put this on pause and factor that. So as you're doing this, you should be looking to see is there a GCF between all four of them. So when I look, 10, 5, 4, and 2, there is not. And then the x's, x squared, x, and nothing in the last one means I can't factor out an x. So that means I'm going to go to grouping, and because there are 4 terms, I can do grouping. So I'll separate it, and I'll factor out the GCF of the first group, which is 5x times x plus 1. The second group is plus 2 times x plus 2x plus 1. Oops, I left out a 2 in this first group. When I took out the 5x, it should be 5x times 2x plus 1. And then the second group, 2x plus 1 also. So I was looking ahead and knowing that I have to have these the same, and that's where I caught my mistake. And so hopefully you will do the same thing as you're doing these, to go back and see that make sure you factored each one correctly. Then the last step, I take what's on the outside, put it in parentheses, take the part that repeated and was the same, put it in parentheses, and there's my answer. And you can go back and check it at this point. I'm not going to do it right now. Okay, so this problem also says to factor. So go ahead, put this on pause and factor it. So when you're doing it, you should be looking at it and seeing, this time there are 3 terms. So I'm not going to do grouping because grouping is 4 terms. So when there are 3 terms, right now the only way you know how to factor is to try to factor out a GCF, which it definitely has. So between 3, 27, and 9, the GCF is 3. And between x to the third, x squared, and x, there's a GCF of x. Make sure you factor that out. Then 3x times x squared gives me my first term, and then times 9x, and then plus 3. So that has factored out the GCF, and that's all you can do with that one. That one's done. Okay, this one says solve, and 30x squared equals negative 20x. So I know I need to follow the steps of solving an equation. Step 1, get it equal to 0. So that means I'm going to add 20x to both sides. I want there to be a 0 on the right. So when I add it, I get 30x squared plus 20x equals 0. Step 2, I'm going to factor. So I have to factor out a GCF from those 2 terms. And the GCF will be 10x. When I multiply 10x times what is 30x squared? 3x. 10x times what is 20x? Plus 2 equals 0. Step 3, set each part equal to 0. So I'm going to divide it up here and say 10x equals 0, and then 3x plus 2 equals 0. Step 4, I'm going to solve each part. So in the first part, I'm dividing by 10, and I get x equals, anytime there's a 0 on top, it's going to be equal to 0. Hopefully you know that at this point. Second part, I'm going to subtract 2, get 3x equals negative 2, divide both sides by 3, x equals negative 2/3. Take my answers and put them into braces. I'm putting the smallest one first, then the 0, and that's my answer.